The theory of evolution is supposed to be an account of how life came about, well, how life progressed and developed and diversified. And it's supposed to be based on our scientific observations. The problem with that is that it actually contradicts our scientific observations. And what we find when we look at the theory of evolution is that it's full of magic. It's a magical world where things that don't actually happen in reality are promoted as happening in reality. And today I'm here with biophysicist Dr. Cornelius Hunter. We're going to be talking about one of those pieces of magic necessary in the theory of evolution. So welcome, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Rebecca, so much. Delighted to be here. Can you bring up those slides? There's this new paper out of UC Berkeley, Dipti Nayak's lab at UC University of California at Berkeley. Came out a few months ago, and it's on the DNA code. And I did a few videos on this on my channel, but I'd like to go into it with some more detail because I think this paper is more important than people realize. And it's really very interesting also. So without further ado, let me go through these slides. It is on the DNA code, as I mentioned. However, it is about a variant of the DNA code, and things are getting interesting with variants. So it's not on the standard DNA code. But the DNA code, as people will know, has always been claimed as this really powerful slam dunk proof of evolution. So it's become a real icon of evolution. It was discovered in the 1960s, right there smack in the middle of the molecular evolution, molecular biology explosion of the mid 20th century. And so 1960s, it was discovered, and not long after that, it started to become touted as this, really powerful evidence for evolution and common descent. So let me give a little bit of background on that to begin with. Just some people may be familiar with this. I won't take long, but just to go through very quickly, what is the DNA code and why is it a slam dunk evidence for evolution? And then that'll segue into this paper. So here is the DNA code. There are 64 symbols or letters, and there are 20 amino acids that are used in biology. This is 20 standard, typical amino acids that are used in our cells to create proteins. Proteins are made of amino acids. There are many more amino acids in chemistry, but there are 20 kind of canonical amino acids used to make proteins in biological cells. So you have 64 symbols coding for 20 amino acids. There's also a stop and a start message. So you have 22 different messages, 64 symbols. So there's a redundancy. You have more symbols than you have things that you need to code for. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. That's kind of interesting. But the other thing that was really interesting about the DNA code that was immediately or soon discovered in the 1960s and 70s was that it's universal. Now, you can't know for sure that it's universal because we haven't looked at all the species, but all the species that we looked at had the same code. And that was another very interesting discovery. So I've drawn a picture there of kind of a notional evolutionary tree. Time goes up. And so those yellow circles are the extant species that we observe today, the living species. And then beneath that is the species of the past. So all of those yellow circles, there's millions and millions of species today. They all have the standard genetic code. And when you have the same thing appearing in different species in evolutionary theory, that means it comes from their common ancestor. When you have a similar design in all the species, then it must go back to the common ancestor of all the species, known as the LUCA, last universal common ancestor, taking you back to the very, very early, billions of years ago, the very early stages of evolutionary history. Before that, you can have some life as well, but there's at some point where, this is the last universal common ancestor. Okay, so that's interesting. The genetic code is there. This is a pretty complicated thing. This code is not trivial. It's there in this rudimentary initial 4 billion-year-old, not even, I wouldn't even call it a bacteria. It says subbacteria. So evolution therefore requires that the DNA code must have arisen very early in evolutionary history. That should be obvious. And then it requires that the code was frozen thereafter, that's interesting. So something about the code, like you have all this evolution taking place, right? You have single unicellular life going into, bacteria evolving to eukaryotes. And then you have single cellular life to multicellular life. And then you have fish, and then you have amphibians and lizards and birds and mammals. I mean, the evolutionary ground that's being covered is monumental, the designs and everything. And yet, you couldn't change the DNA code. So, and yet you had to have a lot of code change happening right there in the early stages of evolution. So kind of strange thing going on there. So huge contrast between it arose very early, somehow, we don't know how, and then, but it never changed for billions of years while evolution was doing its thing. So those two implications, so there's two implications that come out of that. The code is not evolvable. And then the code initially arose somehow. Evolution wouldn't really, to say that it evolved wouldn't be quite the right word, because we just said it's not evolvable, right? So it arose somehow. So Francis Crick, co-founder of the Nobel Prize winner, co-founder of the DNA structure, famously called it a frozen accident. So it's like somehow we got it, somehow it arose. So the implication of those two implications are that it's not special, because there wasn't much time. It had happened quickly early in evolution when all you had was rudimentary organisms. So probably not a special code, and it couldn't have evolved the way we think of evolution, like natural selection, honing a design and optimizing a design. That apparently, that explanation doesn't seem to be available. So it's kind of a special kind of story here that somehow this thing arose. So then on top of that, evolutionists make these assertions. There's no reason for this particular code. So then I want to get back to, well, why do they say that? Remember I said there's 64 symbols and there's only 20 amino acids, and then the stop and the start. So it's like, is this thing was this designed or not? Like, it doesn't seem like it's very elegant. If it's redundant, why would it be redundant? That's kind of dumb. And then also, there's no reason for it. Also, if you just look at let me flip back to the code itself. If you look at this, and I won't go through this in detail, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of, there's some organization. There's definitely some structure, no question. It's not like totally random if you ponder it. But if you look at it, at first glance, it's like, oh, okay. I mean, the stops are right there in red, kind of sprinkled in somewhere. The start is over here in green, and it does double duty with methionine. So, okay, why is that? I don't know. It just doesn't, it kind of is anti-teleological. It doesn't seem to exude design. And that, by the way, is the heart of the origins theory, origins debate, right? Teleology versus anti-teleology. If I say teeth are for chewing, you might say, well, yeah, of course. Are you sure? Do you really agree with me on that? Because evolutionists don't, and the Epicureans didn't. They would say, no, teeth are not for chewing. Be very careful on this. They're not for chewing. Say, well, wait a minute. Why do evolutionists say that? Why do the Epicureans say that? They say that teeth happen to be good at chewing. So no one doubts that teeth chew, and they're good at chewing. So everyone agrees with the basic fact. Teeth chew. The question is, are they for chewing, or do they happen to be good at chewing? And then because they luckily arose and they happen to be good at chewing, then you had the natural selection take over. They were retained. They stuck around because they helped. So natural selection, yeah, it was implicit in Epicureanism 2,000 years ago, not explicit. Darwin gets credit for making that more explicit, really driving that concept home, but it has been around long, long before him. So this idea of the Epicureans and evolutionists are anti-teleology. Now, I still haven't explained why. Why would they say that? Teeth are not for chewing. Teeth happen to be good at chewing. Why do they do that? It sounds kind of strange. You're kind of stretching it here. This seems like kind of a dumb theory. Well, because if you say that they're for chewing, that implies a designer, and that implies divine intent, a creator or something, some sort of an agent that's powerful enough to do all this. And if that's true, then that agent is responsible for my tooth aches and my backache and all the other things, the blindness and predation and earthquakes and diseases and on and on and on. And also just things we don't really like, not necessarily evil, but just things we don't really like. Plus, that means he's getting into the world. He's really involved in the world. And that seems like theologically awkward because he's supposed to be, sovereign and mighty and high up. And so there's a lot of arguments against, a lot of theological arguments against this idea of that God actually getting right down into the muck and creating the worms and everything and the teeth. And so there's this very strong theological tradition for thousands of years that the world must have arisen independent of God. Maybe God set things up, maybe he assisted, maybe he helped, but it must have arisen independently. So that's the whole idea behind Epicureanism. That's the whole idea behind Darwin's arguments and the evolutionist arguments. It's anti-teleological because you have these problems with the world and theological doctrines that mandate that versus, well, the natural explanation, teeth are for chewing. That's just natural. I mean, of course, it's for chewing. This is the heart. This is the core of the origins debate. And so I like to try and, when I teach my origins class, I really want the students to grasp this distinction between teleology and anti-teleology and what this means. For chewing versus no, they happen to be good at chewing. If you get that point, that you'll get the core, what's really going on in the evolution origins debate. So you look at this DNA code here, it's kind of anti-teleological. I don't really see the point of all this, right? And so it kind of fits with this evolutionary view that it wasn't designed. So back to my slide here. The code is not special because it arose rapidly in early evolutionary history and also just doesn't really look special. So there's no reason for this standard genetic code, the standard genetic code or DNA code. There's no reason for this one. It could have been another one. This is just, and so that gets to the accident part of Crick's phrase, frozen accident. There's no reason for the code's universality. So regardless of what the code actually is, it's the same in all the species. It's the same in all this. It's a conserved across the species. So this is two very significant findings. It doesn't seem like a special code, and it really can't be special if evolution is true because it had to evolve so quickly in early evolution. So we got that. It's not special, and also there's no reason it's universal. And why would it be universal? That doesn't make sense. So, well, it does make sense if common descent is true. If evolution is true, then yeah, you would expect it to be universal. Well, maybe. If it's not evolvable, and it kind of makes sense that it's not evolvable because remember a minute ago I said there's all this evolutionary territory being covered, 4 billion years, tens of millions of species. But if you have a code and you change something in the code, you could see how that could really throw a wrench into the works. You just have a mutation in the code, and all of a sudden, one of your symbols codes for a different amino acid. All your genes are going to be screwed up. So it kind of makes sense that it's not evolvable. It kind of fits. So there's no reason. The reason that makes sense is common descent. That's why it's universal. But if God were to have created the species, independent creation, why would he use the same code on all the species? He can use a different code for each one. So let me give you some quotes to kind of illustrate what I'm trying to represent the evolutionary viewpoint here. So let me give you some quotes. So there's Francis Crick, and he famously said the DNA code is a frozen accident. So frozen, what does he mean by frozen? Here's a textbook. The code is then what Crick called a frozen accident. The original choice of code was an accident, but once it had evolved, it would be strongly maintained. So there's the frozen part. Once it evolved, it would be strongly maintained. It couldn't change it. And here's a recent paper here. Once it was established, it being the DNA code has remained under very powerful selective constraints that kept the code frozen in nearly all genomes. So there's that frozen. What about the accident part? The code seems to have been selected arbitrarily, subject to some constraints, perhaps. So it's just kind of an accident. Here's a book by an evolutionist. Different species could have different genetic codes. So there's nothing special about this code. It's just arbitrary accident. Every living thing, from the smallest microorganisms to the largest whale, makes protein using essentially the same arbitrary code. Accident, arbitrary. So this is the evolutionary viewpoint here. No reason for the universality. What about that? Every living thing, from the smallest microorganisms to the largest whale, I just read this, I know, but I'm reading it again because he says, I'm going to go on here, makes protein using essentially the same arbitrary code. What sense does this make? There's no sense for all the species to have the same code. What sense does it make? Unless all these forms of life evolved from a common ancestor, a single ancestor. So I'm just kind of giving you some quotes to back up what my representation of evolutionary thinking. Here's another one. The universality of the genetic code is important evidence that all life shares a single origin. For the genetic code is what? Similar between species, but would not be if the species had independent origins. So universality is powerful evidence for evolution, and it's a real icon of evolution here. So, well, there actually are a lot of problems with this whole argument, and it's really blown out of the water if you stand back and look at it critically. First of all, it's not empirical, and so evolution likes to present itself as science. So when you say, well, if God did it, it wouldn't be conserved. That's not. There's no experiment I can do to check that. I can't test that. So that's a theological doctrine. It comes right out of the principle of plenitude, a centuries-old religious theological doctrine. Very important, very powerful. We looked at that on an earlier podcast. But the DNA code is just a great example of how the principle of plenitude is active and powerful in today's science. It's not like something from centuries ago. It's right here, right now. I can show you papers, from just a few years ago talking about this. It's not scientific. And what I mean by that, well, if you say that there's no reason for the universality, you're ignoring genetic transfer. So genetic transfer of genetic material, and when I say genetic material, I'm talking about DNA and RNA. The transfer of genetic material between organisms is super important in biology. It's just think of the world, the biosphere is kind of a fluid situation where you've got tens of millions of species, and how many individuals do you have in the earth? But between them, there's a lot of messaging going on. So you have genetic transfer, and a lot of this genetic transfer is protein coding genes or protein coding segments that aren't going to work if you don't have the same code. So you have to have the same code. So to say that, well, there's no reason for the genetic code, I mean, that's just it illustrates the power of plenitude. The plenitude thinking is so powerful that evolutionists have lost track of the science. And they're saying these things with conviction because the theology is so powerful, not realizing, oh, wait a minute, of course it has to be a universal, otherwise this whole thing's going to crash. Like biology wouldn't work. So they say evolution is fundamental to modern biology. No, of course not. It contradicts modern biology. And this is a great example right here where it just makes no sense at all. I mean, of course you have to have a universal code. And then another problem is that, well, actually the code isn't quite universal. There are these variants, and that finishes up with my introduction to the DNA code and the evidence that for evolution, the argument for evolution, and this paper out of UC Berkeley. So there are these variants to the DNA code. Now, they're not completely different codes. That's why they call them variants. They're just minor changes, minor differences. So you wouldn't say that it's a different code.
Okay, wait, before we get into talking about that though, I want to sum up and talk about the first part, because there's a lot of people who may watch this who haven't heard you talk about these concepts before, and there's so much there. So, like you're saying, one of the biggest pieces of evidence for evolution is that the DNA code is shared nearly universally. But, that is actually there's no reason for there's no okay, wait, I'm losing my train of thought.
Why would that prove evolution?
Yes, what makes that a strong evidence for evolution?
What's the argument? And the argument is it disproves the alternative.
And the alternative is special creation.
Yeah, special creation. Yeah, God created these species, independent creation. He didn't have to do the same thing on each species. He could do it independently. So they call it independent creation. And this makes no sense on independent creation. So argue the evolutionists. So again, that's why evolution is a theological theory. It totally depends on these theological convictions and doctrines.
But in all of that you read, there was no mention of special creation. There was no mention of God. And so a lot of people will push back on this and say, where did we say anything about God? We're not talking about God. We're talking about, look, all of these organisms all share this same code. What could possibly be the explanation for that except that they had a similar origin? But the problem with that is that no matter what we find, they can make it work with evolution, right? If we find variants, and like we have, they'll make an excuse for that. And it's actually, but so did you want to say something?
That's one problem, but this gets into, how to read a book. If you need to actually listen to what the evolutionists say and read what they're saying, because you're absolutely right. It's often very easy to come away and saying, oh, there's no religion there. So you have to be attentive, and you have to know the history of thought and what's feeding that, because they actually do make those statements, but they're so quick and they're interleaved with the science. So I'll go back to this slide right here. For the genetic code is what? Similar between species, but would not be if the species had what? Independent origins. So that's kind of a key word. That's a code word for God creating the species. So yeah, that's one of Darwin's contributions, is he kind of sanitized the language and gave it a scientific patina. So it sounds like, oh, it's just all this technical, jargon. But all the arguments are utterly hinging on theological doctrines and theological assumptions. And this is one of them. Like this argument absolutely falls apart. You have no traction at all with this argument if you don't have the principle of plenitude buttressing. It's not resting on the principle of plenitude. So it's a common thing that you see in religions, in sects, that they don't even know. They're not practitioners today are unaware of what they're resting on. And so they make these claims and say, well, where did that come from? Oh, it actually came from this guy that was like the founder of this religion. And, we've all forgotten about him now. Now we just say this. So that's what I do a lot in my writings and my blogs, is to bring that out and show, like, see this sentence right here, see this argument they're making. Okay, let's break out the argument. Let's spell it out step by step. And you see that there's a premise here. And that premise was very quickly stated, or maybe even ignored altogether. So you do get this shorthand. Sometimes they just throw these phrases out like, well, what sense does that make? Oh, I guess science proved it. Well, no, wait a minute. What are you talking about? That actually goes back to theological utilitarianism, or the problem of evil, the problem of dysteleology, principle of plenitude, on and on, God of the gaps. So you have all these kind of one-liners that get thrown out, but when you ask, well, what actually is the argument? So that's what I did, was I traced the history of those arguments. I looked at the argument. I said, where does that come from? Find out where it comes from. Find where it was actually spelled out in more detail. And yeah, it came from the Lutherans or the Anglicans or the Wesleyans or the Catholics or, wherever. So yeah, it's really very interesting.
And so when people hear this presented as the strong evidence for evolution, and they're a lot of times their natural responses, yeah, that does seem like really good evidence for evolution. Like, what you want them to be aware of is that the reason it feels that way is because of ideas that they have already accepted that are theological in nature, that have nothing to do with scientific observations.
Right. And so, and when you say they've already accepted, sometimes it really is in our gut. And it's not, you never even have heard it before, but when you hear it, it's just like, yeah, that makes sense. God wouldn't do that, but you don't even quite consciously understand what you're agreeing to. It just makes sense. And so, yeah, it doesn't necessarily depend on you having accepted some, weird theological doctrine. It's kind of intuitive to us that, yeah, God wouldn't create worms. Like, why would he do that? And so these certain beliefs about God that are tempting for us.
And so as we go on, like, we're going to see that even though this is used as a strong evidence for evolution, that evolution is malleable. It can adjust to whatever our observations find. So when we found variant codes, now that's perfectly okay within evolution, right? Because it didn't actually have to be universal, because the theory can adjust. But we're going to show, Dr. Hunter's getting ready to show why it's not so simple. In order to have a variant code, you'd actually need some magic here, because this is not going to be something that can happen by a natural process, at least not one that we have, figured out or observed. So I'll let you go on with that.
Yeah. No, thanks for the elaboration there. It's all good. So there are variant codes. They're very rare, but they are only one-offs. They're just a slight variation on the standard genetic code. So you wouldn't call it a different code. It is, the word variant is appropriate. And I'll just give an example here. Here's the CUG symbol that normally codes for leucine, but in one we found in one organism, it switches to serine. Serine is an interesting amino acid, by the way, because if you look at the DNA code, it's one of those amino acids that's not contiguous. There's a couple of amino acids that are kind of sprinkled around. If you look in this first top row, there are 4 symbols that code for serine. And you see that most amino acids are kind of grouped, like they're grouped. But then serine also appears in the far right column here. There's a couple of symbols that code for serine over there. So, and then you have this one, this unusual variant where CUG also can code for serine. So kind of interesting. Okay, so you do get, things like that. If you look at, so the argument that evolutionists have made on that, and to be fair, this may be kind of reasonable, that some of these variants are plausible. You could have a mutation is conceivable that would create this change in the code, and the change that you're making isn't that big of a change. Like, those amino acids are kind of similar, so you're not introducing like a huge chemical change. You've got hundreds, if thousands of proteins in the individual, that are going to be impacted. I mean, there's a little more than that. I mean, tens of thousands. I mean, every protein is going to have a leucine, at least one leucine. You got multiple leucines. And well, how many times is CUG used for coding the leucine? That may be not that common. It's probably an unusual. I'm not sure about that, but CUG might be one of the lower frequency symbols for leucine. So every time CUG is used, now that's all of a sudden going to be a serine. Now, leucine and serine actually are not chemically similar. These are not, leucine is a hydrophobic, serine is a hydrophilic. So this is not a great example of a similar substitution going on. But maybe the times that CUG is used in those particular locations in the protein, the serine actually can do something smart. I'm just making this up. I'm trying to find a way to make evolution make sense here, because under evolution, you have to imagine that this evolved, that somewhere along the line, there was a mutation. And the CUG symbol was now used for serine instead of leucine. But my general point is that it's not totally inconceivable. It's a minor change, and maybe that happened. However, if you're going to concede that point, and we really don't know, no one's ever actually, well, there has been some experimentation on changing the code. But usually when you change the code, it doesn't help. You have to kind of enforce it to stay that way. You have to put on a selection constraint on it, because you're usually degrading the organism. But anyway, if you're going to concede the point that, yes, you could have some variant codes evolve, that doesn't seem to be out of the question. That opens Pandora's box, because now all of a sudden it's like, okay, you had how many billions of years, and how many millions and millions of species, and how many mutations? Could you not, if you're going to start allowing that the DNA code could have evolved with these minor changes, couldn't there be a lot of those? Why are there so few? We found very, very few of these. They're very rare. Why would you not have more of them? Why not have a ton of them? Why not have them build on stuff? Maybe the code is evolvable. So all of a sudden you've opened up that Pandora's box. So you get this tension, an internal contradiction within evolutionary theory between the code is frozen, it can't evolve, it's unevolvable. I just read you those quotes, these papers and textbooks, these severe selection constraints, it's frozen. Except it's not frozen. So that's a tension you're going to have to work with, right there. The minor variants of the standard genetic code fall into the common descent pattern. That is another assertion that evolutionists have made. That, okay, yeah, there are these variants, but guess what? They fall into a common descent pattern. When we look at which species have this variant, they fall, it's all in this clade. It's in this lineage in the evolutionary tree. It's not just sporadic. So this argument has been made by evolutionists that, well, at least it's giving us yet more evidence for common descent. That's pretty good, isn't it? I mean, can't you buy that? Well, the problem is that's a false. That's blatantly false. It was false when it was first made. That argument was first made in the 1990s, I think, and that I know of. And it was not a good argument then. Today, it is a terrible argument. They're sprinkled around the evolutionary tree. It makes no sense at all on evolution. So that was a false prediction right there that evolutionists made. But
so are you saying the same minor variant is spread out, or is it different minor variants?
The same.
Wow.
And I'll show you a concrete example in just a second. Okay. One second. Yeah. Now, I showed you a minute ago an example of a variant code. And I said, it's kind of simple, and you could kind of envision how that might have happened. CUG was changed from leucine to serine. Okay, there are other variant codes that are more complicated, because they're not just switching some assignments; they're actually introducing a new amino acid. There's a couple of amino acids that are added to the fray. So instead of 20, you now have 21 or 22. And so those are called expansion cases, where you're expanding the code. That now is a different ball game. Now we're starting to get into something a lot more complicated. It's a lot more difficult to write that off and to just, I could imagine a mutation happening. Maybe that could happen. So the way that these typically work is you're going to take one of these stop codons, like that UAG, which is referred to as the amber stop codon, and use that one for a 21st or a 22nd amino acid. So now you're making this very interesting change. That's what this paper is about. This paper that came out a few months ago is about pyrrolysine. Pyrrolysine is another amino acid that we call it the 22nd amino acid because it's a non-canonical amino acid that is used rarely, very rarely. These are rare cases, but they're in single, typically unicellular organisms like bacteria and the archaea. Recall that originally if you're old enough, you'll remember your high school biology class. You learned about prokaryotes and eukaryotes. That was the two big kingdoms aside from funguses and all that. But you had eukaryote and prokaryotes. Now, after Carl Woese in the 1970s and 80s at the University of Illinois, he discovered a third class called archaea that's kind of in between the bacteria and eukaryotes. So these archaea sometimes have these variant codes. Archaea are often in extreme environments, like very, very hot thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, super hot fluid coming out, or in high pH environments, extreme pH environments. And so they have some interesting needs, right? So some of them include this pyrrolysine, this 22nd amino acid. Okay, so that's what this paper is about. We've known about this for all, but it's studying this more. They found some organisms that treat this in kind of an interesting way, where they have this code. They're using that stop codon to code for pyrrolysine, but it is ambiguous. Sometimes it codes for stop, and sometimes it codes for pyrrolysine. So that's kind of interesting. It's not deterministic. It doesn't appear to be deterministic. They searched for why it does it one way or why it does it another way. And they were unable to come up with an understanding.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like it goes along with the evolutionary story because, okay, see, it's still that's how it's evolving. It's sometimes being used as this and sometimes being used as stop. Perfect for evolution.
Right. Yeah. If I was an evolutionist, I'd say, yeah, look, why would God do it that way? And it looks like it's in the process, right? It's kind of in the process. So you could make that argument. So anyway, so that paper is out of UC Berkeley a few months ago. I just want to say a few words about amino acids so we can understand what we're talking about here. We're talking about a variation on lysine, which is up here in the upper right. Let me blow that up so we can actually see it. So there's lysine. So the top part here is the backbone. This part shaded in green is the side chain. So the backbone is the same between all amino acids. That's what makes it an amino acid. And the side chain, it that differentiates it from one amino acid to another. This is lysine. It has 4 carbons and then a nitrogen. So it's got the hydrocarbon chain, 4 carbons, and then an amino group at the end, giving it its positive charge, typically positively charged in aqueous environments. So that's lysine, and it's a super important amino acid. And there it is. There's a line drawing of it. So on the right-hand side, you have the backbone, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons, and then your amino group at the end of the side chain. Now here is pyrrolysine. You've got that side chain. The backbone here on the right. The same backbone, and then the 4 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons, and then you've got a nitrogen, but then you've got this big thing stuck on the end of it. So it's really pretty significant now, much heavier duty. And it's got an oxygen, so it's got a carboxyl group there, and it's got a methyl group hanging off this ring. And this ring here is a pyrroline ring, or a pyrroline. This is a ball and stick representation of it. On the right-hand side is the backbone, and then there you can see the ring there. So it's a much bigger deal, and it helps with some of the catabolism that the organism has to do in these extreme environments. Okay, so that is this pyrrolysine amino acid, and organisms that incorporate pyrrolysine into some of its proteins, and there are hundreds of proteins that are going to incorporate pyrrolysine. Organisms that have that capability, so they have this variant code, they label that as PYR plus. PYR is the abbreviation for pyrrolysine. So all of the amino acids have a 3-letter abbreviation. So PYR is the abbreviation. PYR plus is the label given to organisms that have that DNA code variant. So there are the idea that this evolved. Obviously, evolutionists would say, yeah, well, this evolved. What I said a minute ago, this is going to get more complicated. This is a different story now, because it's a little bit harder to envision. In fact, it's a lot harder to envision. You can't just have 1 or 2 mutations doing this. So there are actually several failures, pretty significant, I would say hard failures with the evolutionary narrative when you start looking at something like pyrrolysine, a PYR plus organism species. And so the first one would be the complex implementation, just to how would this get implemented in these organisms, in these species. Like, that's kind of a tall order. Species using pyrrolysine in their proteins require what? Genes for both the biosynthesis of pyrrolysine. You have to make the amino acid, so you got to have the metabolic pathways to do that. That's biosynthesis. And then you have to do something with it. You have to incorporate the amino acid into the protein synthesis process. So as you're cranking out these proteins, oh, I need a pyrrolysine here. And then you're also going to have to, that protein has to do stuff, do things. And so you have to have the regulation and the associated, catabolism, the pathways that are where that's going to be used. So there's a lot of stuff that has to be there present in the organism for this to work. It isn't just, a little thing. So I'm just summarizing that previous slide. Biosynthesis, incorporation, and then the catalysis steps, pathways. In the biosynthesis, you use lysine as a substrate, and you build on that. That makes sense. In the incorporation, you have to have a tRNA. tRNAs are the carriers of amino acids. When you're cranking out proteins, you grab these tRNAs and grab the amino acid off of them. Now you have to have a new tRNA that is going to have pyrrolysine glued onto it. And then you need to have this new protein machine, amino acid tRNA synthetase, that is going to do that, attach the amino acid pyrrolysine to that tRNA. So there's this small army of proteins called amino acid tRNA synthetases that do this job. And they recognize the different amino acids, and they recognize the different tRNAs, and they glue the right amino acid to the right tRNA. Well, now you got another one. You had 20, now you got this other one that you got to glue on. So you got to have the tRNAs, then you have to have the protein that charges the tRNA. So, okay, there's a lot there. And then you have to have the genes and the catalysis pathways and the regulation and so forth. So there's just a lot going on. This is a list of some of the genes that you need to do these different things. So it's not like just a mutation. I mean, you actually need a whole bunch of new genes. Like, where are those going to come from? Like dozens of genes. So that's a problem. Complex implementation. Another one is convergence. Well, I said a minute ago, it doesn't fit the common descent pattern. And I said I would show you an example in just a second. Well, here it is. So look, in this paper, they showed their evolutionary tree. And here is a part of it. This is just a part of this evolutionary tree showing the PYR plus, the pyrrolysine variants to the DNA code. So species are listed here on the right, this list of text, this text list here. In the diagram, the gray triangles represent species or groups that do not have this pyrrolysine code variant. Where you do not see the gray triangles, where you see the line, the regular evolutionary tree depiction there, those are species that do. And so if you look, you see there's like where my mouse is, there's some there, there's some there, there's some down here, there's some here, there's some here. It's not a common descent pattern. It's sprinkled around. So there's
one. This is amazing. And I loved this part of the video on your channel. And I want to take this opportunity to recommend your channel, which is Darwin's God. And Dr. Hunter recently made a very concise video on this and talked about this. And I thought this was great because a lot of people don't realize they've been taught to believe that evolution is this beautiful tree of nested hierarchies. And that is false. It's the trees are a mess everywhere. There's no tree. And this is one of thousands or even possibly millions. Don't know if we've even counted, but of places where the tree makes no sense. Because what you're seeing here is that this had to evolve independently a bunch of different times. And that's what we find, not just with this, but with almost nearly every feature in life at the molecular level and at every level. Almost every feature has evolved independently at some point. So if you wanted to make a list of, places where the thing makes a nice tree and it only evolved once and it's spread out, then you'll have a very short list. So
exactly. And when you talk to evolutionists, they will, on a regular basis, almost always refer to the nested hierarchy and how everything just fits into the evolutionary tree in this common descent pattern. And I mean talking about professors in serious forums like debates and such, like they just say this with a straight face. And you realize this is a mythology. It is a deception because, as you rightly said there, Rebecca, it fails over and over and over again. There is no nested hierarchy. It does not fit. This diagram I'm showing, or this example I'm showing here, is typical. This is not exceptional. It's over and over and over again. You see, it doesn't fit the common descent pattern. And philosophers have this concept and this terminology called theory laden. And what that means is, when you look at data, when you look at observations, you're looking at it through the lenses of your theory, with your theory in mind, and you're fitting the information into your categories and your templates and your theoretical, explanations. And so things are either normative or they're anomalies. And so here, if you look, the parts that you could pick out as like where it does kind of fit, like for 4 species or something, it fits into an evolutionary tree, then that would be normative. You said, yep, see, it fits the evolutionary tree. Oh, well, that's like, there was a weird convergence that happened, or there was an earthquake or something. And so that's what happens is you interpret the evidence from a theory, not a theory neutral perspective, but from a biased theory perspective. And then you come away with these claims of like, well, it all fits a nested hierarchy. It's like, no, it doesn't. So it's important to keep that concept in mind. Here's another example there. So, and here's another example. This is what they actually referred to in the paper, this Hypothermomachium profundi organism. If you look at that, that's the top one right there. Above it are species that do not have this DNA code variant. And so, right there, and those do. And so if you zoom in there, look at that red line, it had to have evolved in that red line there. because prior to that, you could not have had it, because those were feeding that evolutionary lineage feeds into species that do not have the code variant. And after it, all these species have the code variant. So it had to evolve right there. And so that was a relatively short period of time that it had to have evolved. And then it had to happen over and over and over again. So it's what they would call convergence. It doesn't fit the pattern, but it's not only that you have convergence, but it's rapid. It has to happen rapidly, which is going to be another problem for evolutionary theory. So now you're having a pretty complicated, here's the third problem. It's not frozen. Remember, we talked about, it's frozen, and the variants that you do have, well, they're minor variants. This is not looking so minor. And so now the whole frozen, you have to get this internal tension I talked about earlier, that it must be frozen. You must have these strong selective constraints. And yet, it just happens all the time. Well, not all the time, but it happens, easily. So that the whole frozen accident claim starts to look weak. And a fourth failure, you need to evolve the extended gene. Now, what do I mean by that? So let me show you. So remember, I talked about how what happens here is this stop codon, the amber stop codon, UAG, is now going to not be a stop codon. It's going to interpret, it's going to give pyrolysine. Okay, so you've got this, originally you had a protein coding gene, and at the end of it was a stop codon. And this one uses UAG. So that's the amber stop codon. Okay, great. And now you've brought in this new code variant. Aha, I now am carrying the pyrolysine code variant. Oh, this UAG codon, this symbol no longer is a stop. It now codes for pyrolysine. Whoa, I just added a whole ton of additional coding sequence to my protein. This additional sequence here on the end can be dozens or even hundreds of amino acids. So I had a protein that might have been 100, might have been 80, might have been 150 amino acids. Now I'm lopping on another 100, 50, 100, 150 onto this thing, not to mention the pyrolysine. What's that going to do? If I'm just adding some random sequence of amino acids, that's most likely going to not do very well. Do you disagree? Are you saying I'm making this up? Are you saying that I'm just being a naysayer? Wait a minute. This is what the evolutionists said all along. That's why it was not evolvable. Remember, we just read those papers. You've got these powerful, strong selective constraints that make it so that it's frozen. Evolutionists were the ones who were saying this. And now all of a sudden, oh yeah, you just wreaking havoc here on these genes, these gene products and the organism. But it's okay. Well, how is this going to work? Either this code here is pre-coded, it's pre-adapted, as they say in evolutionary theory, pre-adapted, or it has to adapt very rapidly, because we saw how quickly this has to happen, which is not realistic at all. So you're either left with lightning fast evolution happening, which is not feasible, or you're left with pre-adaptation. That was just convenient. That code was that DNA segment was conveniently sitting there, just waiting for pyrolysine to be the DNA code variant to be introduced. Well, that's teleological. So this is not working under evolutionary theory. This is a major internal contradiction under evolutionary theory. This is why evolutionists have always justified the universality of the code. Any change of the code will wreak havoc. Well, now all of a sudden, I guess we have to drop that. Okay, so those are some of the problems. There's actually more problems than that, but those are 4 key problems with this whole idea of this code variant evolving. So what does the paper say about this? Here we discuss the conundrum of how PYL encoding archaea have evolved to navigate an ambiguous amber codon. How did this happen? So they're particularly interested in this problem that it's ambiguous, that sometimes it's stop and sometimes it's pyrolysine. But there's also the problem of how could it evolve in the first place? Well, the fact that this code variant must evolve so fast is yet another problem for evolution, right? I mean, this has got to be a huge problem. Oh, wait a minute. No, it's not. In the paper, they don't say it's a problem. In fact, they just talked about a conundrum, but that was really just it's not really such a big conundrum, because the paper actually says this is an observation. They have observed the pyrrolysine code variant arising. So they've actually observed it. So it's not like a huge problem. They maybe don't quite fully understand it, but they've observed it happening. Like this is empirical science, guys. They've observed this code variant evolving. So it evolves. Now, maybe we don't fully understand it, but they've observed it. So I'm thinking,
wait, do you mean they've actually observed it, or have they evolution observed it? Like looking back at like what they say is the common ancestor and
you got me again. You got me again, Rebecca. I can't fool you.
Okay.
Let me go on here. They say they observed it. Quote, this process appears to be relatively swift, as it can be observed in archaea. And they'd point out this particular, hydrotherm Archaeum profundi that I just referred to in that evolutionary tree. Continuing, given the speed and ease at which this process apparently occurs, this is not that big of a deal. Speed and ease? If true, I think this would be a monumental discovery. This is Nobel Prize. This is the whole shebang. So let's have a look. Oh, we saw this. I looked at these slides, and it evolved right there. That's fast evolution of this capability, this code variant. There are many other examples, like there and there and there and there and there and there and there. All these examples, and here's the look at the big tree. These variants contradict the common descent pattern, as I mentioned, but I didn't put the slide in, so let me verbalize it. But that's what they meant when they said they observed it. And you called me on it. When they said we observed this is observable, what they meant was we've reconstructed an evolutionary tree, and it must have evolved right there. I can see it right there. It must have evolved, so I'm observing it. So I'm getting back to my theory-laden concept from the philosophy of science. They are literally calling this an observation. They've used their computer and cranked out an evolutionary tree and say, look, we observe the pyrrolysine code variant evolving right there. And so it must happen with speed and ease. They actually use these terms in the paper. It must happen with speed. It must not be that big of a problem, because they're wondering, like, because you have to acquire all these genes I was talking about, for the biosynthesis of the amino acid pyrrolysine, and for the incorporation of it into the process, and for the catabolism. So there's a whole, small army of genes you have to get. How's that going to happen? And then you have to, do all those other things, the code, the extra code that's added on, extra DNA sequence has to be, mutated appropriately. And there's just all kinds of these problems. So they're kind of like skipping over that and say, hey, well, it's not that big of a problem because we observe it. You can just observe it. And so this is an example of how evolutionary theory is corrupting science. So, I mean, this is so fundamental. It's so basic. Like, it's almost it is embarrassing. This is not like subtle. It's not. It's really a dumb. It's like saying 2 + 2 = 5 because I just saw it on this computer screen or something. There's so many problems with this, and they're presenting it to the reader as a given when it's so obviously theory laden. And this went through peer reviewers. So you've got editors of the journal, you've got peer reviewers of the paper, and you've got several authors of the paper, leading institution, UC Berkeley. I mean, I know these people are good scientists. This is how the theory has corrupted science.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And so for those watching, if you're new to these ideas, you have to be careful when they say, we've observed this. Pay attention. What do they mean by that? Because what they mean is that they've created these common ancestry trees. And if it seems like there was a jump, then they say, okay, see, we observed it. We saw this. It wasn't here. And they're pointing to what they think was the common ancestor. And now it's here. So it evolved, and it evolved quickly. And it's really interesting because the things that a lot of times when you hear them say, this evolved more rapidly, it's some of the most fast evolving stuff around.
Right.
Well, what they're doing is they're recognizing something that needs to evolve rapidly. And so they're putting that label on it. They're assuming that it did. So, you don't have to start with the assumption that evolution happened. What we're supposed to be doing in science, right, is looking at observing the world and trying to figure out how things work. But what's happening right now is that evolution is the foundational assumption, and everything is built as if it's true. So thank you so much, Dr. Hunter.
Yeah, you bet. My pleasure. And it's a good example of theory ladenness and how that can be really harmful. And another good example of that was Aristotelianism in the 16th century. And it had been around for 1,000 years. No, the 2,000 years. You get that right. And it had just become a tautology. Like whatever you discovered, whatever you were looking at and asking questions, like, oh, well, that's the final cause. That's the property of that object there. That's how it works, and people were getting sick of it. But so that was very much theory laden. They were looking at the world through the lenses of Aristotelianism, and everything was interpreted that way. And it was breaking down. It was just like ridiculous. Like you're just making these things up. And so people like Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes came along and revolutionized science and brought us into empirical science. Well, I see so many parallels between Aristotelianism and evolution today. Same sort of a problem. It is so ridiculous when you read the papers and read what they're saying.
Okay, so summarizing on the problem with this variant, the first problem is the chicken and egg problem, where it's like you've got, in order to make use, if this mutation happened in the code to make the code, you would already have to have all this molecular machinery in place to receive that mutation and make use of it, right? Like
yes,
to receive that mutation and be able to work with the new amino acid it's coding for. Okay.
I mean, because when you say that, it forces me to remember that that's a fundamental problem with the DNA code in general.
Yes.
So that's just the whole evolution of the DNA code has this monster chicken or the egg problem.
And there's chicken and egg problems all throughout life at every level.
It's
so
it's the nature of a complex machine.
If we did every week a video on chicken and egg problems with evolution, I don't think we would run out for many years.
I believe you're right. But you have all these, for this particular variant, you need a small army of genes to make all this stuff work. Because it's an expansion of the DNA code, not just a simple reassignment. It has to be way more than just a mutation or two. So that's the first bullet on this slide, is the complex implementation. In the paper, they refer to that they're well aware of like all these genes that are required, and all they say is like, well, it acquires those genes. The magic word, it acquires them. Yeah,
evolutionary magic.
Yeah.
And then
now let me just follow up on that, because there is this. Remember I talked about genetic transfer. That's a reality of biology. There is a lot of genetic transfer, which is why the DNA code needs to be universal. So you do have this genetic transfer between species. And so that's going to be the go-to explanation here for the acquiring of these genes. Oh, well, it was horizontal gene transfer. But it's a lot of genes. It's not just a gene. So you have to have horizontal gene transfer of a group of genes. Well, that's possible. It's not impossible. But then why would those genes have been assembled in a group that is so easily transported like that? And why are they transported to these species and not others and so forth? So there's just all these problems of like, it just seems like it's too good, too easy. You know, you just happen to get these genes together in a group. Remember, this is so easily forgotten. Back to my teleology versus anti-teleology. Evolutionists will always kind of naturally fall back to a teleological explanation. You ask them, well, why would you have all these genes together in a group? Well, because that they work better together. I mean, they provide this capability. They provide this capability that the archaea needs, this inclusion of pyrolysine into some proteins by virtue of changing the DNA code, adding this variation. So it makes sense that they would be, oh, well, that's teleological. Remember, evolution cannot have the foresight. These genes had to have come together in this group that could be transported. It's not just the biosynthesis of pyrolysine. It's also the incorporation. It's also the catabolism, those pathways. All these, for these different applications, you have to have genes. How could they have just been conveniently put together by a blind process? Remember, it has to be anti-teleology. You cannot invoke, well, it makes sense. Well, those are going to provide for this new capability. So if that, you have to say, well, it was just random. It came together randomly, but it worked, and so therefore it was selected for. Now you're bringing a mutational load problem, and that everything is just happening. Just these incredibly complex, narrow, particular configurations have to happen all the time. So it's just very difficult to build a theory that this world, the entire biological world, just fell together spontaneously, which is exactly what evolution claims, right? Like Epicureanism. It just came together spontaneously. That's you're going to run into some really big walls.
Problems, the convergence problem of this happening in so many different places. We got the not frozen. So, this idea that the code was universal, it's supposed to be universal because it's not evolvable because there's so many constraints. But then, oh, we found a variant. No problem. Okay, I guess it's okay. And then you have the problem of the stop codon now not being a stop codon. That creates a major problem in the DNA, like when, trying to
that evolutionists have always pointed out and been concerned about. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's not a problem. It's just not a problem. There's like zero evidence, zero reason to think that it's not a problem, except for it has to be not a problem.
Yeah. And okay, so I guess that now would be a good time for comments.
Yes.
All right. So Aprender, and by the way, I'm going back to the beginning and going through the comments. So if you're just putting up a comment now, it'll be a little while before I get there. But Aprender said,
I'm sure this commenter, so after you typed the comment, probably realized soon after that I did use that term. So I did use the term standard genetic code several times. Yes, I'm well aware that it's called the standard genetic code. It's also universal.
Yeah. And so have they left off from calling it universal now, where they used to call it universal and now they don't? Or
no, I think we still call it universal. And again, getting back to what I said, the variants are variants. They're not completely different codes, because you have just this is one little thing. I think that is legitimate. It still is 99% the same code. So these very much are one-offs on the standard genetic code. I guess I should say, as per this comment here, usually you will see in journal papers the term the standard genetic code. So they are making a distinction between variants and the standard. So the standard is the canonical, and then you have these variants.
I see. Okay. now this is off topic, but I'll put it up. Junior asks Dr. Hunter, or hi, ask Dr. Hunter how exactly the phylogenetic calculation is done for evolutionists to arrive at Eve of 200,000 years ago. I already know, but just in case I'm missing something more technical.
Yeah, I mean, this is like way out of scope and would take too long. Plus, it's really not
Yeah.
my expertise. Also, I'm not really into the whole Adam and Eve problem. I know that gets a lot of attention. It's just not something that I have gotten into. So I wouldn't even get it quite right anyway. I will say Joshua Swamidass has really looked really carefully at that and done some pretty good work on that. So you can look at his stuff. I'm sure you probably already have, and he's an evolutionist, but nonetheless, he's done some really good work on that.
Cool. Wes says evolution doesn't do what they say it does. They have the burden of proof to demonstrate that it can create new genes. For instance, plenty of evidence that evolution can't do that.
Yep, I agree. Yep, exactly. You do need to. I think the important thing there, and the good comment is, don't assume a burden of proof when they haven't established their claim. And so that is a real common, misstep. Is like, oh, I have to falsify what he's saying. Like there's a toaster in orbit around Jupiter. No, there isn't. Like I can prove that. He's never even, he has no evidence for his claim to begin with. You don't have to disprove it.
Right. And maybe that's a mistake I've been making because I'm often giving people scientific reasons to reject evolution. And you've told me, I think you're taking on a burden of proof you don't need to take on because they haven't given you any reason to believe that it's true in the first place.
Right.
Right.
Right. And
the problem with that is that so many people are so convinced. They're convinced that it's been shown scientifically. So how would you go about breaking through to those people if you're not willing to say, these are the scientific reasons you shouldn't believe?
Well, I think it'll do double duty. So when you ask someone, well, how can you support your claim? That's when you can start to open those people's eyes. When yes, they are blinded. Yes, they're deceived. Yes, they believe it's a fact. No question about it. You're an idiot for questioning it. But when you ask for, okay, well, can you just explain? Give me some examples. Give me some. What are the top 3 evidences? Why is it a fact? Force them to walk through that, and then you can then, with your knowledge of how the arguments actually work, you can respond to them appropriately. So I think that not assuming the burden of proof, but rather forcing them to work through that proof. It's like if someone says there's a toaster in orbit around Mars. Force them to, why try and disprove that? Just say, well, what, it really is at that level of craziness. We're at that level. When I use an example like that, it sounds like an extreme example. It isn't. That's where we are today. And so you need to, if someone were to make that claim about a toaster, you wouldn't try and disprove it. You wouldn't do that. You'd look at them a little strange and you'd say, okay, can you tell me why you think that? Because it's so weird.
Right. So, and what you mean when you say that's where we are today is that people have accepted that level of absurdity.
Yes.
When it comes to evolution. Yeah. It's actually just as absurd as saying there's a toaster around Jupiter.
Yeah.
So
that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. It is that crazy. Yes, that's what I'm saying. It's not, we need to get away from this idea, which creationists and others have promoted, that evolution has some good things about it, and it captures part of it right. It just makes these certain errors here. It's like, no, it's a fundamentally flawed problem that is so deeply flawed from all angles. You can look at it from the science, you can look at it from the theology, from the philosophy. So it is so absurd, and we have to take off the blinders and really understand what is it saying, and force them to say what they're saying, because they want to get away from the actual claims that the theory makes and kind of soft pedal it, right? And make it sound, well, it's natural selection operating over, biological variation with allele frequencies changing, and making it sound a lot less heroic and a lot more scientific and more jargon. It's like, oh, okay, I guess it's a fact.
Right. Yes. Okay. Now, but in continuing on with this comment about the creating new genes, I see headlines all the time, titles of papers and things about de novo genes, new genes created. We've seen new genes being created. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Like, where are they getting that?
Yeah, there's two places where we're getting it from. One place is from what we talked about a minute ago, the inference. And by the way, the phrase we were talking about, if evolution is true, then this must have evolved fast. There must be convergence. There must be all this craziness. The term for that is phylogenetic inference. So you are making a phylogenetic inference. I've got my phylogeny, which is an evolutionary tree. I'm now inferring that, oh, this must have converged. This must have diverged. This must have rapidly evolved. Some magic happened. So those are phylogenetic inferences. So one source for the de novo gene evolution and things like papers that you see is the phylogenetic inferences. That it's just, yeah, well, we've observed it. We know that these proteins evolve rapidly because we've observed it in our phylogenetic tree, right? So that's one source. Another source is the actually legitimate, there really are marvelous adaptation capabilities in cells. Biological cells have incredible adaptation capabilities, directed, intelligent adaptation capabilities, which it just blows our mind how powerful and intelligent these things are. And we don't quite understand how they could do it. Like, how does this little tiny thing do this? But it does it somehow. And so it appears as though these adaptation capabilities, not only can you have directed mutations, and of course, a lot of regulation magic that goes on via epigenetics and so forth, but also creating new segments of DNA. And this is kind of a recent scholarship. There wasn't really, I think it's like 10 years old or so. So I'm not sure exactly where it's going, and I'm not sure exactly what the state of the art right now is, but I'm just pointing out that there is room for there. It is amazing what cells can do, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if that includes creating new proteins, but it's not by random mutation, natural selection. Like
Right.
that is, I think that would take a whole lot more time than what we're seeing here, and it's all of there's paper after paper looking at this problem of how could RM plus NS, that's random mutation plus natural selection, how could that mechanism create a protein, a native protein, 150 amino acids that folds up and does this function, and over and over, repeatedly these studies find it's just not going to happen. It's just the statistics aren't there. You need, the age of the universe is not old enough. You would need, millions and gazillions of universes. You don't have the resources to do this. It's just so unlikely, the probability of this happening. And it's not like evolutionary theory. The evolutionary process just has all day to just experiment and just try random amino acid sequences over and over and over again. Let's see if this one works. I mean, the organisms are going to die. You can't just have that kind of luxury of experimentation. So, I mean,
Right.
I'm skipping over like dozens of problems with this problem.
Okay.
So, from an evolutionary perspective, it is a very, very difficult problem. By the way, it's my false prediction number 3 or something. But that doesn't mean you cannot have new proteins arising in the biosphere. Today, there could be a new protein arising in some bacteria somewhere in New Guinea. But that has nothing to do with evolution. So it gets to one of the other deceptions, which is any change is evolution. If you find any change, that proves evolution, because the alternative is static. The alternative is the creationism world where nothing changes ever. So, and that's just a ridiculous straw man argument.
Right. So you're saying the changes that we're seeing take place are changes that look like these are things the cell, at whatever place in the cell, there's a capability that's there to change.
Right.
And we already know that from alternative splicing and things where
Oh yeah.
they, the molecular machinery can take the same gene and chop it up and arrange it in a way to make a different protein according to the needs of the organism,
Yep,
which
exactly.
is
It's a great
amazing.
example right there. Great example. That's not creating a new gene, but it is creating a new protein or a wildly different proteins can come from the same gene depending on the splicing. So alternative splicing is an amazingly powerful device of just after you transcribe the gene, you make your copy. Okay, now I'm going to go to work on this thing and splice out sections of it according to the current needs, my current physiological needs of the organism. I'm going to create this protein. So yeah, you had 20,000 protein coding genes, but the fact is you can make hundreds of thousands or millions of different proteins from them because of that editing capability, post-transcriptional splicing capability. That's really cool.
That's really amazing. Yeah. Okay, so Wes also says calling it an accident means we can use probabilistic arguments against it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think,
This is the frozen accident thing.
right. It's very difficult. These are difficult because evolution dwells in the shadows, right? They make these claims about these problems that are just, unbelievably difficult problems. Very, very difficult to evolve, but it's also difficult to narrow down some sort of an accurate probability because this is just these crazy problems. But in principle, yeah, I agree with Wesley. Yeah, it's the if you can hold evolution to its claims of being scientific, then anything scientific is amenable to quantitative analysis, including statistical arguments, statistical calculations about probabilities. So yeah, you're going to be science. Okay, let's do that. Let's go down the science route. And all of a sudden we find out, oh, it's all falling apart. And you can get these probability estimates that it's ridiculously improbable.
Wes is on fire tonight. What can I say? He's just got all kinds of good comments, but he says, no worldview is strictly scientific or rationalistic or religious. We are all working within paradigms which include all the above and more.
Yeah. So on this one, I will disagree. I'll take the over under on this one.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a common argument that people use, and it yeah, there's a certain school of Christian apologetics that proposes this sort of thinking. We've all got our biases, we've all got our paradigms. That's so let's just lay them out on the table and force the other guy to lay out theirs and compare these. Yeah, you can say that, but that would be, again, let's go back to the toaster example. If somebody says, a toaster is an orbit around Mars, and it's a fact, am I going to kind of, well, we've all got our bias. I just have these biases that, I'm just kind of a quirky guy. I don't believe that because of my biases. You've got your biases that make you believe that. I got my biases that make you not. No, I'm not going to go there. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's accurate. I think the accurate thing is you have a serious problem, and I'm a realist, and you're theologically driven and that's driving you to absurdity. And I'm not going to put myself on that same plane. We're not operating in the same plane. It's not like I'm a red guy and you're a blue guy and we oppose. No, you're severely screwed up, to be frank. If you believe that, you've got some serious zealotry going on. You're being driven by non-empirical, non-scientific concerns that's driving you to absurdity. And I'm just a realist, and I'm willing to consider, all kinds of theories. I'm not biased against things. I'll consider evolution, for example. I'll look into it. I'm not like, if it was scientifically compelling, I'd be all over it. I'd be the first one to say, oh, I was wrong. So yeah, I think from a biblical worldview, you have the luxury of being objective about these things and looking at things from a realistic perspective, and you're not driven to absurdity. Whereas, evolutionists don't have that freedom.
Yes. And this is, Wes follows up with this. Now, this is like a recent response to what you're saying. So he says, we ought to correspond to evidence and reasons, of course. Some views are more justified than others.
Yeah. It's an interesting discussion, and it's something I run into a lot. And it's called presuppositional apologetics. And Van Til is the guy who really is the mastermind behind that. Cornelius Van Til, I think. By the way, I think it's in the right setting and the right context, it is a powerful apologetics. So I'm not saying like it's all messed up or anything, but I think you just need to be very careful with it. I've seen it taken too far.
Okay, so the Rickster says, why not point out all the problems you have with evolution with a biologist? Well, it just so happens Dr. Hunter is a biophysicist, so I am talking to a biologist. But I'm starting to wonder if somebody set this up as a bot, because this same comment has appeared quite a few times. Like, this is a separate time, like a little bit later.
Oh, yeah.
So I think somebody set this up.
Yeah, I'm getting bot comments too on my channel.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so Tony, okay, wait. Okay, this is Tony's talking to Black Hat here, but I think this is a good comment to respond to. Tony says, I'll show you some of the newest evidence from studies of DNA that convinces most scientists, including myself, that one leg of Darwin's theory, common descent, is correct.
I would say that's at least one leg. I mean, I would say it's pretty fundamental to Darwin's theory. I do realize, yes, that you can find papers saying that maybe common descent isn't true and everything, but yeah, it's pretty important. So it's saying it's one leg might be understating it a little bit, but yeah, can you put a link up there in the chat? Then we can maybe talk about it on a later podcast or something. I would love to see it. I'm totally open to seeing what this new evidence is that convinces most scientists like yourself of common descent. I will be the first to say, there are very, very powerful evidences for common descent. So I'm not saying there aren't powerful evidences, but I've looked at every one that I can get my hands on, but I may not have seen that one. So I'd be delighted to see it.
But when you say there are powerful evidences for common descent, you don't think that those they're powerful, but they're not good, right?
Well, to be more specific, they're not scientific.
Okay. Yes.
Right. They entail theological premises. So they're very, very powerful, but they're religious. And they sound scientific because the religious premise is just the first step, and then all the rest is numbers and science and biology and physics and stuff, but it all hinges on the principle of plenitude or theological utilitarianism or so forth and so on. So yeah, usually you would, and by the way, we've talked about this before, but it's worth repeating. The more powerful it is, the more non-empirical it is, the more religious, the more theological. That's where the real power is. And we've talked about this before, where I want my students to feel that. I want them to feel the weight of the argument. If you don't feel the weight of the argument, if you're not like kind of set back and like, just like the commenter said, most scientists, including myself, we're convinced by this. That's what I like. I like those arguments. It's like, wow, this is powerful. So I'd love to see that argument or that evidence, because those are the ones that we need to understand. Those are the key ones the ones where you're like, wow, that's really powerful.
And in your experience, those powerful ones are theological, not scientific.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. No question about it. Yeah. They always are, and they're not biblical either.
Okay, so Blood Always Finds Its Level says adaptation is the dangerous magic. It's so magical, the creationists agree and call it microevolution.
All right.
So YEC agrees with a little magical evolution. You can't make this up. I'm curious to hear your response to this.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's the evolutionists. I mean, there's a lot going on with, I'm sorry, creationists. There's a lot going on with creationism. They do need to have those kinds, right? Because the ark only has so much room on it. And so you can't have, tens of millions of species on the ark. And so what they need is a canonical set of species, which can then give rise to the tens of millions of species via evolution within kinds. And so the term microevolution kind of fits that. It's kind of similar. I think creationists would like to expand that a little bit, go beyond just microevolution, but they need that evolution within kinds, because they don't want to have God creating things after the ark, creating additional species. So they have to happen naturally after the ark. And so, yep.
Well, this is confusing for people because so often you talk about the Bible and being a Bible believer, and yet you say, I'm not a creationist. And like you're kind of speaking against the idea of the animals being able to fit on the ark. So it kind of leaves people spinning because it's hard to figure out where you're coming from. And almost every time somebody says he is the creationist, he is. So do you mind clarifying for people, do you believe in the flood? Do you believe in animals getting on Noah's Ark?
Yeah. So I don't mind clarifying but my guiding rule, first of all, I'm not a world-class expert. I'm not a Hebrew guy. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a pastor. So I'm not like hard over on my Bible interpretations. So I don't feel that I'm authoritative or I'm a teacher on this. I do think I'm a teacher on the science and then the history of religious thought invading the science and corrupting the science. So that I think I got that. But so that's point number one. Point number two. One thing where I differ from a lot of Christians, I have this one fundamental difference with a lot of Christians that I run into and talk about this, some kind of different on this, is I am not dogmatic about things that the Bible's not dogmatic on. So I see a lot of Christians feel like they have to hold fast to a particular position on everything. Church, do you have to be a member of a church? Oh, well, yes. Oh, no, you don't. Well, the Bible is not dogmatic on that, in my opinion. So I'm not going to have a dogmatic position on church membership. So that's just a simple example. So when you talk about now I'll get back to your question. The flood. Was there a flood? Question number one. Question number two, was it global or was it local? So I think I do think there was a flood, because I do think that's pretty strongly communicated in the Bible. I think I could say it's dogmatic. The Bible's dogmatic on there being a flood. So I believe there was a flood. Is it local or global? I don't think the Bible is dogmatic on that. And it's just a complicated, and even within those categories, there's subcategories. What exactly do you mean local and so forth? And if you read the passages carefully, it's like, oh yeah, it kind of sounds like it's global. And then, oh, wait a minute, and there's plenty of places in the Bible where it says the whole world or the world or something, and they're really just talking about the Middle East, and that's obvious from context or when you read the next chapter or something. And so, yeah, I don't believe the flood was local, and I don't believe it was global. Well, what do you mean? What do you believe then? I don't believe either one because I don't know. So I'm not going to take a position on something I don't have enough evidence on. So that's my difference is, I'm just careful in that way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But then when I see, so a lot of creationists they hold beliefs about what God can and can't do, which I think you need to be careful about. And they do believe in the global flood, first of all, pretty hard over on that. And then they believe that you can only have so many species on the ark, which is practical. And so then you have to have evolution after that, because they don't believe that God. So whereas I would say, well, why can't God create more species after that? Now they would say, well, that's not documented. If there's nothing in the Bible about God creating, he rested. There's nothing about him creating more species after the ark. That's true, but they're saying that there's all this, when the fall happened, the entire creation went through a big metamorphosis, because all the predation and so forth was introduced into the biosphere. So that's undocumented. All we know is that childbearing and food gathering, the weeds are going to grow. So we were given a couple little hints, but we really don't know the details. And they say, well, there had to be this huge metamorphosis occur. So that's not documented either. So we both have to, you're going to end up there one way or the other, I think. So I tend to be less dogmatic on things that I can't be dogmatic on. I'm dogmatic about, Jesus is alive, and without him, we have no hope. Okay, that I'm really dogmatic about. I believe Jesus is alive right now, and he's your only savior. He's the only Son of God, and you have to believe in Jesus to be saved, and we're all sinners. There's no, if you're not a sinner, boy, you're well off, more power to you. You're in a special group, but no one has actually achieved that. And so short of that, you need Jesus, and it's free. It's totally free. Like, there's no pushback. There should be no pushback. Like, this is free. You don't have to do anything. And so it's a really good deal, guys. And he loves you, and if you doubt that, he died for you on the cross. It was like the most painful death in history, and he did that for you. So, like, okay, this sounds pretty good so far. And yeah, that's the story. But you have to believe in that, and just accept that. And that is impossible for some people, because that requires admitting that you're a sinner and all kinds of other things that become obvious. So yeah, I'm dogmatic about that. I'm dogmatic about the Trinity. Like, I'm really dogmatic about the Trinity. So it's all that. Be strong on the fundamentals, but not on the non-fundamentals. Don't confuse those, and that's what you want to do. Be careful not to confuse those. Don't get hung up on church membership or child baptism, infant baptism, or global flood versus local flood, or pre-mill versus post-mill. I mean, these are all fine to think about and talk about, and we can argue about them. If we need to argue, okay, let's argue about them, but let's not take that too far. And understand, if the Bible, because the argument, what I've seen the arguments made over and over again is the same sort of argument that evolutionists make, which is, well, the other view must be false because it makes no sense on the Bible. Therefore, my view is correct. The same sort of argument where it's not.
Well, why would God do it that way? God
Right.
wouldn't do it that way. Like,
right.
The same types of evolutionary arguments. God wouldn't make DNA, the same.
Yeah.
But
the
then
same
the creationist. Yeah.
I call rationalism, rationalistic or rationalism sorts of arguments. They're invoking deep theological claims, which you have no business making, and then arriving at, therefore, church membership is this, or child baptism is that, or whatever. I don't begrudge people holding their views on these things. I get it. But don't hold the view more strongly than you are entitled to, because your only evidence is Scripture.
Yeah, and I want to go back to something you said, because you kind of told people, hey, look, Jesus died on the cross for your sins. It's free. Why would you not accept that, right? Like, why would you resist that? And, you said, but you do have to believe. And I want to talk to people about what that means for a minute, because a lot of people get really hung up on that idea, but let me just explain it to you in a simple way that maybe you can relate to in your daily life. Sometimes I ride in Ubers, and when I get into an Uber, I don't know that driver. I am trusting my life with that driver that I don't know at all. Okay, I'm putting my life in his hands. That driver could drive me out into the woods. That driver could run us off the road. That driver could do anything with my life at that point, right? But I make a choice when I get in that car that I'm going to trust that driver. Even though I don't know that driver that well, I'm trusting. And that is what God is actually asking you to do with Jesus, okay? That you're going to trust that Jesus is going to get you to where you need to go. I trust the driver to get me to my destination. You're going to trust Jesus to get you to the destination that he has promised to take you to. He has promised eternal life to all who believe. So it's like getting in the car saying, look, I may not know everything. But I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to trust and I'm going to put my life in the hands of this person, Jesus Christ, who has promised to give me eternal life, to get me to that destination. And it's as simple as that. You're trusting him. It's not about how good of a person you can be. Of course, God's happy when we do good, right? Like God likes that. But you know what? That, like Dr. Hunter said, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, right? We've all sinned. We all need the gift of God in Jesus, his sacrifice for our sins. So it's not, you don't have to become this instantly good person. No, you're trusting him to, fix up whatever needs to be fixed up in you, to heal you and to get you to your eternal home. So that's what it's about. So consider getting in the car with him. Okay. That's my preaching for tonight.
I like that, Rebecca. That's a nice analogy, because what you're pointing out there is it's not something strange or deep or like, well, what does it mean to believe in Jesus? Like, how do you get there? It's not like understanding quantum mechanics or some sort of a deep meditative state. Meditating with a certain kind of binaural music going, and incense, and there's a lot of songs you can listen to, pop songs, where they say, believe in me. Do you believe in me? Or, and they're just talking about, like, in a relationship, you believe in your spouse. All it means is, I'm on board with it. I accept them, and I believe that they're sincere, and I believe in their motives, and I believe in their view on life, or their take on things, that sort of thing.
Yes, and actually the one that comes to mind is that song. I don't know if you've heard it, but it goes, will you still love me when I'm no longer young and beautiful? I know you will. And I love that song because this person is proclaiming their trust in their romantic partner, that person is going to love them when they have nothing left as far as physical beauty and things to offer. And that is the promise that God has given us. He has given us that promise. He has made a promise to us that's good for all time. His love never changes. That's who he is. And so,
and we are, and it's a great point, because we are facing a bad situation in the sense of aging. We are looking at decay. We are looking at growing weaker, and it's like, okay, we're going to go through this. I'm not sure I like this. I'm headed down this road. And so there is this, it can be a loss of hope if you don't have something. And that's the one of the beauties of Christianity, is it gives you this hope, but yet there's tons of evidence for it. I mean, it's rock solid. This isn't like just, I want hope for hope's sake. God is giving us something that we need, the hope, but with abundant evidence and conviction.
Yes. And what are you talking about when you talk about that evidence? Are you talking about
I mean,
historical evidence? Are you talking about evidence of the Spirit of God when the Spirit of God is with us? Or what evidence are you talking about?
it's all of the above, really. That's the beauty of it also, is there's so many categories. You can go to the actual manuscripts and look at the actual written Bible and analyze that, and then analyze the other historical documents around it. And so is there really a guy named Jesus? What was there really a town of Jericho? And what evidence do we have that these things actually happened? And there was a time centuries ago where, in the height of the Enlightenment and so forth, there was extreme skepticism of all this stuff. It's like, that does not really happen. And slowly the archaeologists started to uncover that stuff and say, oh, there really was this. Like, there's this evidence for that. And so now there's really no question that, yes, there was a guy named Jesus. He did do miracles. In the people ascribed miracles to him. His contemporaries who were not sympathetic ascribed miracles to him. So in other words, Jewish leaders and non-believers of the day said, yeah, he does miracles. So that's like not in doubt historically. That's a good witness right there. Things like that. Yeah. So there's that. Then there's all the other categories you mentioned. So yeah, there's a lot to plumb if you want to get interested in that sort of thing. But of course, I still like I guess my number one category is just reading the Bible and reading the words of Jesus and those around him. And that is such a dynamic, teaching tool and faith building tool, learning tool to blow your
And
mind.
I also, yeah, I totally agree. And I've seen both myself and other people, like, when they get captivated, reading the Bible, it is transformative. And I have seen people absolutely transformed when they start reading the Bible.
Yeah.
And I also want to say that, in addition to that, one of the primary ways that people are coming to Christ in the world is from what Jesus is doing in the world today, because he's still working today. He's still doing miracles today.
Right.
And many people are calling on Jesus and experiencing a miracle. And so, that's one way that you can, like, know that it is true, is you call on the Lord, because he's close to those who call on him in truth. And so he's still active in the world today. And that's one of the things about, evolution that is problematic, right? Because what you've talked about is one of the primary things that's kept evolution in business is this desire to get God out of the dealings of humanity, to get God away from creation, so that people can explain why, when they need a miracle and they don't see a miracle, why did it not happen? The bad things that happen, and to get away from the problem of evil, or to make an excuse for God.
Yeah, we're definitely living under a deception today, a mythology that there are no miracles, and Jesus is not, even for people who believe or are open to the possibility that the Bible is right. Well, that was 2,000 years ago, and today it's science and F = ma, and there's really nothing beyond that. And that's just all mythology. As you say, he's alive now and in people's lives now. So yeah, that you can go, that is a huge experience to have when you're a Christian.
Yes, thank you so much.
I've had so many prayers answered. I've made these prayers, and I will tell you, sometimes I think this is ridiculous, because I'm asking for something that's too big, too unlikely, too ridiculous. It's kind of silly, really, what I'm asking for here. And it happens. It happens.
Wow.
And yeah. So too many times I've seen my prayer answered.
Me too. And I mean, we could probably talk about those times all night, but this has been a great, rabbit trail. I mean, I guess this is actually kind of why we're here, is because we want people to know the reality that evolution is not true. And that's, part of the bad effects that it's having, is that it's blocking people from seeing the reality of God. And so that's my ultimate goal, is I care about people seeing the reality of God and who he is and his love for you. So that's what motivates me in this.
Amen. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple more comments that I just wanted to put up really quick. And one of them is from Frank. Our good supporter Frank says, the more we learn about life, the more magical the mythology of evolution becomes.
Yep. So true. Thank you, Frank.
Yep. Well, and then there was, I'm trying to look through and see if there's any final comments that I wanted to put up, because there's been a lot that have come in, but I think they're mostly arguing amongst themselves. I will put up this final pushback from Wes. He says, sorry to say, Dr. Hunter is wrong here. Microevolution involved random mutation and natural selection. Creationists don't believe that is what causes the vast majority of adaptation we see. I'm a little bit confused about this comment. I don't quite understand. Do you understand what he's trying to get at here?
I'm not quite sure. I don't think I do, but let me just address the second sentence there. Microevolution involved random mutations and natural selection. Yeah, I think that's an accurate. An evolutionist might want to appeal to some other mechanisms as well, and of course they have a raft of downstream mechanisms where Rm plus Ns is kind of the fundamental, but then you have all these other things. But I think in a general sense, yeah, it's going to all come back to random biological variation, which is usually mutations, and natural selection. So I think that's a fair statement. And then he's saying, well, look, okay, so that's what microevolution is. Be careful, because creationists don't believe that. They don't believe that is what causes the vast majority of adaptation we see. So what do they believe? They believe that God did it, I guess, or God created it. So we would have to get into a more detailed discussion of what.
Yep. And yeah. Wes is the great person to have a discussion with, and he put up his correction. Involves. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we got it now. Thank you.
Thanks, Wes.
And then Mr. Brown says creationism is blocking people from learning about evolution. Do you think that's true?
Yeah. So I think the underlying message there is evolution is good science. Evolution is true, or approximately true. It is a fact. And, you guys are really blocking, and creationists are blocking this. So I think to get to the heart of the matter on a comment like this, if my interpretation is correct, is to say evolution is not good science. It is harming science. From a scientific perspective, it doesn't make sense. It violates it. It's not good for science. And it is driven by theological assumptions and theological beliefs. So that critique that I just said is what most people would say about creationism, right? It's not good science, and it's driven by religion, right? Well, that's what evolution is. So you have to deal with your own house,
Yeah, and I do want to say, look, there are places I think it's harmful when people are like raised in, just learning creationism and not learning about evolution. And then they get they grow up, and then they're released into the world of evolution believers, right? And so then they can feel sort of betrayed. And
right. Yes.
I think people need to learn all the things. We need to be exposed to all ideas and be able to.
The problem is you have to learn the real ideas. You have to learn what evolution really is, not the textbook orthodoxy, which is frankly not true, and filling the reader with inaccuracies about the theory and about the science. That's what we're doing on this podcast. We're trying to teach what evolution really is. So yeah, do we want people to learn evolution? Absolutely. That's what I'm doing. But I'm teaching the real evolution.
Yeah. And also, Mr. Brown, I would just encourage you to really think about the way evolution is being taught, because what I've seen is it's total indoctrination. There is absolutely no criticism. This is the way things happened. There is and if you disagree with that orthodoxy, you are in danger of all kinds of things, of being ostracized and talked down to, but whatever. You're
not getting a passing grade, not getting letters of recommendation, not getting
yeah.
accepted into grad school, not getting your faculty appointment, not getting your tenure. There's gates at every step. And if you question
Yep.
evolution, you're not going to make it through. No way.
Yep.
Even if it's a scientific, totally objective, scholarly, rock solid. I mean, I've had it myself. I've been denied things because of that.
Well, let me put this up first, because Dr. Feldman says, I would be happy to have a discussion with Dr. Hunter and defend that evolution is science.
Yeah. So what you would have to do in such a discussion is explain why it's a fact. Why is evolution a fact? Why is it true, as Jerry Cohen says? And that would be what you have to do.
And he also says science is a falsifiable hypothesis.
If that was true, then no one would believe that it's true.
Evolution.
No one would. It would have gone by the wayside a long time ago. We wouldn't be talking about Darwin or evolution if that was the case, if it was falsifiable.
Yeah. And so Wes says, I took biology courses in college and I went to public schools. I feel, if anything, it's the reverse. Where does anyone learn about creationism? Nowhere. Well, that is true in a lot of places. And it sounds like, Wes, you probably had the same type of upbringing I had, which I was in very, secular environments, and I was not taught creationism in any sense. And I came to my views on creationism later in life. And so, for me, this wasn't an issue, but I've talked to so many people now who were taught young earth creationism, and that's all they were taught. And then they kind of got exposed to evolution and the indoctrination of evolution is true. See, this is science. And so then they lost their, faith, and some of them lost their faith. Others just became very ardent theistic evolutionists. So, there are pockets where people are taught creationism only.
But I do appreciate the comeback there against the other comment. It's creationism that's not getting taught, not evolution. I mean, yeah, it's hard to believe somebody in this country not being exposed to evolution and not learning evolution, because we're swimming in it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is true. Like the creationism that I'm talking about, that's a very small percentage of the population. The vast majority of us have been deeply indoctrinated for our entire education. I know I was indoctrinated to evolution by the time I was in 5th grade.
Yeah,
and the way
really.
I know that is because someone asked me in 5th grade, was the first time somebody ever asked me, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And I thought, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, the chicken or the... That was like, that was like breaking my brain. Why? Because I was taught evolution.
Yeah.
So
you did not have a category. You didn't have a category for teleology or design,
right,
creation.
Exactly. Anyway, okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hunter. Any final comments?
Thank you, Rebecca. Really appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me on. Look forward to next time.
Okay, me too. Thanks, everybody.